Hello and welcome everybody. Just looking at the participant lists, I think we have more than 80 joined the webinar this morning, so I'll begin if that's okay. So my name is Aidan Jones and I am the Chief Executive of Relate. Good morning to everyone here in the UK, and for those of you joining this webinar from Australia, good evening to you. I'm really pleased that you're taking part. It's really wonderful to have you with us. Just at the beginning now, I want to give you a reminder that the webinar is being recorded and will be made available afterwards via YouTube. So for this webinar today, we want to share some initial findings from our Families Unlocked study, which is an international longitudinal research study. The study is a collaboration between Relate, the University of Worcester in the UK, and Relationships Australia. And what we wanted to do with this research study is to look at the impact of the pandemic on relationships and family life. Well, it started back in April 2020. Back then, we began a conversation with Dr. Gabriela Misca from the University of Worcester. And the conversation was about the potential that the pandemic gave us for this type of research. This led into the research development work which was done by Dr. Gabriela Misca and Relate's president, Professor Jan Walker. And then in August 2020, which was more or less just about the time the first lockdown restrictions were easing, the study was launched in the UK. This was the first of several phases that were designed to capture the medium and long-term impacts. The first phase completed during autumn 2020, the second during spring 2021. And we're so excited today to be able to share some of the findings of these two phases. And actually there's a third phase that is planned for next spring as well. Additionally, since autumn 2022, the study is being replicated in Australia, where the experiences of COVID-19 and imposed lockdowns have been very different. We're delighted that Nick Tebbey, National Executive Officer of Relationships Australia, will be providing some insights into the impacts for families down under. The ultimate aim of this research is obviously to inform the development of new ways to support families, couples and children during the new normal, whatever the new normal turns out to be, of course, but also through any subsequent waves of the pandemic and any future public health crises. At Relate, the results will help us to look at how recent changes have opened up opportunities for developing different approaches to relationship support. So I want to remind you quickly of the format for today. Firstly, I'm going to invite Dr. Gabriela Misca, Senior Lecturer in Psychology at the University of Worcester, who is leading this study, to make a presentation. Then we will welcome Nick Tebbey, who's joined us live from Australia late in the evening there, to provide some reflections and context for the Australian side of the study. We will then hear from Relate Counsellor Saddington about how the research findings are reflected in Relate's work with couples, individuals, families, children and young people. And then Professor Janet Walker, President at Relationships Charity Relate, will give a presentation reflecting on the study data. At the end, we are planning to have about 10 or 15 minutes for any questions, so please prepare your thoughts about any questions you have as we go through the presentations. Just before I hand over to Gabriela, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who helped to spread the word, promote the study, and to everyone who participated in it as well. We're very grateful for that. So without further ado, I invite Gabriela to make her presentation. Good morning, Gabriela. I do hope you're there, because it would be quite awkward.
I do. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Just checking that everybody can see my presentation.
Faye, I think we need to share the presentation. Is that right?
Sorry, apologies.
Thank you, Faye. We can see it now, Gabriela.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. I'm excited to share some preliminary findings from our ongoing international study, Families Unlocked. Just to set the context, looking back over the period since March 2020, there can be no doubt that the pandemic has not just been a medical or a health crisis, but a social and economical one across the globe. And research emerging since have documented how recurrent lockdowns have impacted families and relationships in unprecedented ways. The imposed isolations forced some people to live closer together within the confinement of their households, and some were separated for a considerable amount of time. In addition, many of us had to cope with increased burden of care as a result of quarantines and caring for vulnerable individuals. Families have found themselves navigating these new challenges without any preparation. And whilst some have done so with remarkable strength and resilience, for some families, these challenges have aggravated existing tensions. And this led to the early concerns about how the high-pressure environment of confinement may lead to rise in relationships breakdown, marital conflict, domestic violence, and child abuse and neglect. Our study, Families Unlocked, it's grounded in a family resilience approach, which provides us with a lens to understand and help families to promote positive adaptation in the face of adversity. Now, with vaccination heralding a return to a normal, or at least a new normal, the task ahead is to shape a positive post-pandemic future. And this can only be achieved by putting forward interventions which can mitigate the negative effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on society and alter their long-term impacts. It is within this context that the Families Unlocked study investigates how families and relationships will play a critical role in shaping the COVID decade, with the ultimate aim is to support interventions. So just to give you a very brief overview of the study, although exploratory in nature, because the pandemic was a natural experiment that we have not encountered in our lives so far, it employs rigorous assessments of outcomes. We were very clear from the beginning that we wanted to capture change, and we wanted to make sure that this will enable us to make comparisons with other studies and population norms. And we have employed for that both bespoke and standardized instruments across a range of domains of individual and family functioning, including health and well-being, mental health, trauma, resilience, family functioning, marital and couple relationship, parenting, as well as coping with stress and life events that happen during the intervening period. We were also interested to understand the occupational domains, how the impact of working from home was, the furlough, the job loss, but also particular groups like key workers who had to continue working throughout the pandemic. We've also assessed pandemic-related domains like health anxiety, loneliness, and bereavement. We're an interdisciplinary team. We bring expertise from psychology, social policy, social work, and public health. And crucially, we employ a cross-country comparison to enable us, to provide us with a reference point. Due to the unprecedented event, and this is already apparent in our studies, how comparing across countries enables us to understand more profoundly the changes that families experienced. So, who are the Families Unlocked? And I'm delighted to report that to date, we've had over 2,500 participants to date. And we've conducted and we finished wave 1, both across UK and Australia. We finished wave 2 in the UK, and wave 2 is ongoing in Australia. So we've designed these waves of approximately 6 months duration to capture change. And we see from the demographics of the respondents that the samples are very similar across countries and across waves. We have captured a broad age range that will allow us to run analysis by age groups. So for example, we'll be able to focus on younger adults as well as on older adults and see how they were impacted by the pandemics. Women are the predominant participant group in our research, and this will allow us to explore how gender roles were shaped by the pandemic. We know that women were the ones who had to juggle perhaps more challenging tasks of household keeping, homeschooling, working from home, and so on and so forth. Just under half of the respondents are parents, and this will enable us to look in depth into the challenges faced by parents. And predominantly, our respondents were in couple relationships, and this will allow us to explore in depth how relationships were affected by the pandemic. Another group of interest are the key workers. And we have significant proportions of respondents in both our samples across countries, because this group of people were affected in different ways. And we wrote a blog on the Relate website on the impact of pandemic on key workers in the UK, based on the UK data. So we started by asking people about the differences that they experienced in their lifestyles. And we know that lockdown restrictions were attempting, at least, to preserve people's opportunities to be active and exercise. So the responses here are those we collected during wave 1, when we asked people what changes they experienced during the lockdowns, and then we asked the same question for when the lockdown eased. Wave 2 data, and here data is reported only for the UK, we asked people to reflect on the changes over the entire period since the pandemic started and compare it to how their lives were before the pandemic. As we can see in both countries, and perhaps as expected, people reporting doing less exercise during the lockdowns and overall less as compared to before the pandemic. Which is slightly concerning is that after the easing of lockdowns, fewer people reporting doing more exercise. So this suggests that there might be a subgroup, about a third in our sample, for which not exercising has become a habit, an unintended consequence spurred on by the lockdowns and continuing after. And this is also illustrated in the increased amount of time watching TV, which was broadly defined to include streaming and so on and so forth. Similarly, we asked people about their eating and drinking habits, and similarly in both countries, about a third of people reported eating and drinking more during lockdowns, and this has not reduced significantly after the easing of lockdowns and remains higher than before the pandemic. So the combination of less exercise, more eating and drinking is likely to cause concerns about health issues in recovery from the pandemic. On the positive side, a third of people reporting spend more time on their hobbies and more quality time with people in their households, and this appears to be sustained across the pandemic period. And this is some of the reflections that people shared with us. And we note the quotes at the bottom that some unintended positive effects of the much publicized link between obesity and the risk of COVID complications, which appear to encourage some people to adopt healthier lifestyles. Then we asked people to reflect on their feelings and their mental states during lockdowns. And in the UK, about a quarter of participants reported feeling lonely and anxious most of the time during lockdowns and overall during the pandemic period. And these feelings do not appear to subside after the easing of the lockdowns. Less people appear to have felt lonely most of the time in Australia. Thus, it may be interesting for us to explore these differences in data to understand what were the risk factors for people feeling more lonely and anxious in the UK, and what might be the protective factors that led to less reports in Australia. Worries about money and employment appear to be a constant feeling reported in both countries and without significant change so far. And this reflects how people experience the economic consequences of the pandemic. We ask people about their feelings about the future, and there appear to be high levels of pessimism in the UK as compared to Australia. And again, this difference is something we will explore further in our data. And there are some examples of how people reflected on their feelings. As expected, worry, stress, helplessness, but also happy and resilience were some of the feelings reported. We note that there are divisions appearing about people's perspectives on the pandemic or about the virus and its handling. And this may act as areas of conflict in relationships. When exploring how couples have experienced the lockdowns, the picture emerging in the UK is couples reporting are more arguing, worrying, and feeling tension more than in Australia. And this is an example where country comparisons are essential to enable us to explore what might have been the risk factors in the UK sample and what might have been the protective factors in the Australian sample. We also asked couples to rate their overall perception of the pandemic on their relationship. And for about a third of UK participants, the lockdown was exacerbating pre-existing issues, and these may be at risk of breakdown. On the other side, while a third of UK participants felt that lockdowns were a positive experience and they were closer than before as a result, in Australia, the proportion of these couples is higher, it's up to 50%. So again, it's something that we will explore, these cross-country differences and potential explanations in this respect. And this is how couples express the strain they felt in their relationships. And the first quote highlights the additional challenges, perhaps for key workers who continue to work throughout the lockdown and the pandemic. And also the quotes illustrate how some couples strived to work through their differences and to find new ways to communicate and to relate to each other. We turned our attention to parents, to our sub-parent group, and exploring data from parents, we observed that the vast majority of parents enjoyed spending time with their children. But nevertheless, 2/3 found it difficult to balance childcare with work and felt overwhelmed as a result. When we asked in more detail about their difficulties, parents reported feeling themselves anxious about their children's education, and overall they found it difficult to create a structured environment for their children, which we know is so important. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the majority of parents reporting their children feeling unsettled. And in data that is emerging from Wave 2 in the UK, we see that these ongoing worries for parents appear to be sustained, and they are mainly around children's mental health, children's online activities, and their schoolwork. And this is what parents told us about their challenges, about how some parents initially struggled with their children, but then managed to find a routine. And I think it's important to also highlight the disagreements in parenting that might have come under focus during lockdowns. And these disagreements between the two parents around, disciplining children are very confusing for the child and overall ineffective. Now, from Wave 2 data in the UK, we had the opportunity to explore in much more detail life events, and bereavement was one of them. And it's undoubtedly a very challenging life event for families. And we see that we had 1/3 of participants in the UK suffering bereavement during the pandemic. And it's important to know that individuals experience multiple bereavements in short periods of time, and at the same time, not having the usual opportunities to engage with grieving rituals, thus raising concerns about the effects of potential unresolved grief. And this is how respondents share their reflections of their experience of bereavement. And we will look to explore these issues in further detail in our data. And I think it's worth noting the last quote, which comes from a key worker who they themselves had the difficult challenge of facing clients and colleagues die as a result of the pandemic. On the positive side, this quote highlights how pandemic offered opportunities to reshape society, for example, by changing perceptions about work and about working from home, and how this led some people to go and find more fulfilling jobs, but also anxieties about going back to work practice expectations from before the pandemic, when people feel that this may not be appropriate all the time. So this has been a very brief overview of our findings, and to perhaps summarize it in a short sentence is the fact that pandemic has shown us that 21st century society remains vulnerable in many ways, and it's about understanding how we're going to address some of those sequels of what pandemic has inflicted in people's lives. We have a rich data set which was only possible to obtain through the commitment of our over 2,000 participants, and we are very grateful for their time in completing our survey. This research has been unfunded, and it was only possible through the combined efforts of colleagues from Relate, Relationships Australia, and Griffith University in Australia. And in next steps, we will be interested in hearing from organizations who are working to support individuals and families about how we might make our findings relevant to their work. So please do get in touch if you are representing such an organization. So how are we going to shape the COVID decade? It's about trying to feed our findings and results via practice and policy briefings, and to support and inform the development of interventions that will mitigate the negative impacts of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Some fascinating findings there. I'm struck by some of the marked similarities and some of the marked differences with the comparison with Australia as well. So very interesting. A reminder that if it's prompting any thoughts for questions, make a note of them. We'll be asking at the end for questions. So please make a note of any questions you want to ask at the end. And now it gives me great delight to welcome Nick Tebbey, Chief Executive of Relationships Australia, to give some sort of thoughts or reflections on the findings so far. Nick, over to you. Good evening.
Good evening, good morning. Thank you, Aidan, and hello everyone. It's lovely to be here. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm coming to you today, which is the Ngunnawal people here in the Australian Capital Territory in Canberra. At Relationships Australia, we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that the importance of relationships and family and community in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. As Aidan said, my name is Nick. I'm the National Executive Officer at Relationships Australia. We're a federation of community-based not-for-profit organisations with no religious affiliation. Our services are for all members of the community, regardless of their religious belief, age, gender, sexual orientation, lifestyle choice, or social or economic circumstances. We've been operating in Australia for over 70 years, providing a range of relationship services to Australian families, including individual, couple and family group counselling, dispute resolution, services to older people, children's services, and a whole range of family and other relationship education. At Relationships Australia, the core of our work is to focus on respectful relationships and maintaining and sustaining the supportive nature of relationships. And so when Gabriela and Aidan and their teams reached out to us at Relationships Australia, we thought this was a fantastic opportunity to participate in something that was a really and is a really important study, as we've just seen from Gabriela, to understand not just the impacts of the COVID pandemic in one country, but to start comparing how it has played out across multiple countries. And just listening to Gabriela talk caused me to reflect a little bit on the Australian experiences of COVID. And of course, things have been a little bit different here. The first thing to notice is that with 8 separate states and territories, the Australian experience has actually differed across the country, let alone between Australia and the UK. We entered our first nationwide lockdown in March 2020, but that only lasted for under 2 months. After that, most of Australia came out of lockdown and life returned to a relative amount of normal by June, July 2020. And so it was a very short period of time that some of those initial heavy restricted lockdowns took place across the country. What we saw, though, after that was an ongoing level of uncertainty about when additional lockdowns would happen and when certain other restrictions would ease. And so one of the major restrictions we've had here in Australia, all the way on the other side of the globe, is a lockdown of our borders and no international travel. And so very difficult for family members to see each other when they're separated by an international border. Within Australia, that separation has occurred across state borders as well, where state borders have been locked down. So some of those elements of lockdown are a little bit different to the UK experience, but they've had a significant impact on Australians and Australian relationships. And then some of our cities and some of our states have obviously been in lockdown a lot more than others. Some of you may have recently heard that the capital city of Victoria, Melbourne, has the unenviable title of being one of the most locked down cities in the world. And it has had well over 200 days of lockdown since that initial period. So for people in Victoria, people in Melbourne, the lockdown has continued. As I mentioned earlier, I'm in Canberra. So for us here, we were traveling pretty well after June last year until only 2 months ago, August here, when the Delta strain arrived in Australia and we saw a new wave of COVID lockdowns. And so I'm quite chuffed. My son returned to school today. So that was quite exciting. Certainly as a parent and a partner, we've lived through a lot of the things that Gabriela just talked about, you know, homeschooling, working from home, managing all of those expectations all at the same time and worrying. And so that brings me back to, I suppose, why we're so excited to be part of this study and really why this study is so important. We need to understand what impacts these changes have had on the lives of Australians. That's really important to the work we're doing at Relationships Australia, but also as a global study, and certainly between the United Kingdom and Australia, to understand the differences. And I think it was quite telling to see some of the data that Gabriela reported, showing perhaps different experiences here in Australia and others, as Aidan said, that were quite similar. We had over 750 people in Australia participate in the first phase of the study. And obviously the second phase is currently underway, and we're looking forward to seeing where that might take us. What we've seen is that here in Australia, perhaps there has been a little bit more positivity, perhaps because of, at least in many of the states, if not all of them, some of the harsher lockdowns didn't last for as long. But we have still seen that money worries and economic uncertainty has been a pervasive issue for Australian families. And I think as it really bore out in Gabriela's findings there, the majority of parents worrying about childcare responsibilities, working from home, children's education, and generally being anxious for their children's future. And I think that's a real commonality. And probably as we start talking, as Gabriela said, about the COVID decade, something that we really need to be focusing on. So for us at Relationships Australia, and I know my time is running out, we are really delighted to have access to this international study, to be part of it. And I would like to take this opportunity to express my thanks to Gabriela, to Jan and to Aidan and your teams for including us. This data is really important to Relationships Australia because it is helping us to see where some of those pressure points are. And I think looking forward to working with the team over the coming year and years ahead to really see on a longitudinal basis how that evolves and where we need to be focusing our efforts in terms of service delivery and policy design to make sure families across Australia, across the United Kingdom are supported now and into the future. Thank you, Aidan. I will stop there. I will say good evening to everyone, and I'll stick around if there are any questions later.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for joining us, and thank you also for partnering with us. I think it's enabled us to have a wider perspective on the study, which I think is really beneficial, so we really appreciate the partnership we have together. Next up, I would like to invite Peter Saddington, a Relate counsellor, to give us some thoughts on the counsellor perspective. Nick, Peter, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I think it's fascinating because, you know, when this all happened, there was no forewarning. We were suddenly faced with having to respond to an announcement that lockdown was happening. And as an organisation, certainly the centres where I work, it was instantly moving into working in a very different way. And I think that, along with the fact that we as counsellors and therapists were going through the same crisis as the people we were working with, is a really unusual event. We were experiencing in our own lifetimes, in our own personal lives, the same difficulties that clients were doing. And I think that that's an unusual event. And I think part of the report talks about the high levels of anxiety and the coping mechanisms that people have needed to be able to survive it. You know, increasing food intake, alcohol, all those things, ways of managing. And I think first lockdown was very different because there were very clear rules. Everybody had to do the same. And I think to some extent that made it easier for many people to manage, whereas subsequent lockdowns have been not so clear in their boundaries and expectations. And so I think in first lockdown, my experience and the people that I supervise, what they talked about were clients talking about high levels of anxiety about what was happening. And so their own issues kind of paled into insignificance by comparison of just their general anxiety about what was going to happen. You know, money worries, health worries. And slowly things started to change in terms of where the anxiety was. And as has been picked out, bereavement, you know, sudden shock deaths, and real anxiety about how this was going to be managed, not being able to grieve properly. And so a secondary element that seemed to occur, I think, was increasing levels of anger and frustration. And this seemed to come not so long after there'd been all the problems with Brexit, which seemed to have a very disruptive impact on lots of families and couples, where there was a real splitting of people having very strong views. And I think one of the things that started happening was people getting very angry, both within their families, both within their couple relationships, but also anger at the government or other people, not being able to grieve properly or to be able to talk about or get support was hugely important. The other one that I want to emphasize is almost on the day of lockdown, we as in Derby Relate were contacted by the local authority to say, would we help set up support for children during the pandemic? Could we provide something? And, you know, we did. And as part of the triaging, talking to parents, trying to set up the service, what emerged really strongly, something highlighted in the report, was the huge anxiety of parents about how they would cope. How they would support their children, how they would manage in these very different and difficult circumstances. And, you know, we were one of the few organisations where parents could talk and express their concerns. And quite often they were wanting reassurance, they felt that they weren't doing their best for their children. So I think we were providing a service that was unique in supporting parents and helping them to normalise what was going on for them. Because I know I'm limited in time, the only other thing that I really wanted to highlight was the difference of how children were responding to it. And one thing that seemed very clear was that children under the age of 11 were struggling much more with the general anxiety about what was going on. The fact that adults, other people were threatening or potentially threatening, I think was really unsettling. And our experience is that the children under 11 were much more anxious, really struggled much more with going back after the first lockdown and coping with those changes. That period of time in children's lives when so much more development takes place, but wasn't able to take place in that way. That disruption, I think, is going to be something that gets noticed a long time after we go back to any sense of normality. So because I'm conscious of time, those are the things that I really wanted to highlight.
Peter, thank you. Some very interesting reflections, if you like, from the coalface, which I think is really, really important. Next, it gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Jan Walker, the President of Relate, to give us some thoughts about possible policy implications and where we might be going with that, policy and practice. So, Jan, I invite you to make your input. Thank you.
Thank you, Aidan, and good morning, not quite good afternoon, UK, and good evening to Australia. It's absolutely tremendous to be part of this work, to be working with Gabriela and with our partners here in the UK and again in Australia. It's an exciting study, and I think one that will complement other research that is going on around the country and elsewhere. There's been a flurry of research about the pandemic, not surprisingly. I think our study is probably fairly unique in the way we're doing it with standardized measures and doing a cross-country comparison. So that opens up all sorts of possibilities for recommendations about policy and practice. And as Aidan and Gabriela said, one of the main aims of what we're doing is to learn how we can better support individuals and families and relationships as we move forward. And as we go on experiencing what is going to be a longer pandemic than any of us could have possibly imagined in March last year, when lockdown was new. It was different, but we didn't expect us still to be here in November 2021, still looking at rising COVID numbers in our country. So we need to be able to learn from this in terms of what are we going to do and what might be the new normal of living with this virus for a long time. And so I've been working with Gabriela to look at the impacts and saying, what can we learn from this study? So first of all, thinking about policy, and it's easy to look back in retrospect and think about how things were done and what we might do differently if we knew today what we didn't know then. Inevitably, the government was faced with, and a word that is used over and over again, an unprecedented experience of a pandemic, a global pandemic. And they obviously had to focus policy on dealing with this very vicious virus and stopping the spread and trying to make sure that the whole economy didn't completely collapse around everybody, with people losing their jobs and losing their livelihoods. So we faced a medical crisis. We also faced a human crisis. Lockdown became necessary. It's had an enormous impact on people's daily lives. And as Peter says, that's all of us. We are all in it together. And government tried very hard to address this medical emergency and to focus on how to manage the finances, job security, development of vaccines, which was obviously seen as the way out of it. What it wasn't able to do at the time, I think, was to understand and therefore to address what has emerged as the very high levels of anxiety and fear, the growing mental health issues that we're hearing about, the loneliness, the pressures, the impact on children, and we are seeing what Peter's seen with young children being much more badly affected, and the lack of rituals for dealing with death. So from a policy point of view, we had a government working alongside both nationally and locally, trying really hard to address something they knew very little about, but at the same time, perhaps not realizing that the impacts on all our lives and our mental health would be far greater than perhaps we might have predicted at the time. So from a policy perspective, we need to look at what we can learn, looking back and looking forward. And if we look at practice, and clearly with Relate and Relationships Australia and all our other practice colleagues around the countries have had to adapt their work really quickly. And so Relate and others have changed the way they've worked. They've seen the emotional support needs for children and families. They've seen the ongoing concerns about relationships and so on. And they've obviously been very aware of the number of deaths and the fact that bereavements have been a really difficult area for everyone to manage at this time, particularly in lockdowns. And there has been, as Peter highlighted, the need for therapeutic support for children and young people. And so having someone to turn to and the enormous value of talking therapies has really, I think, come to the fore. And we know more about that now than we did before. So what are the emerging lessons for the future? And I think one of the main lessons perhaps will be how in probably both our countries, but certainly in the UK, we need to find a more holistic, joined up way of working between government, policymakers, practitioners, and particularly the charitable family support sector. How can we work together to not only deal with the crisis in health and the economy, but also the wider impacts of the COVID restrictions on everybody's life? And if we had been able to do that, then we may have been able to be aware in advance of what we're seeing now. We have been able to perhaps ensure that there is huge emotional support being offered to everybody who needs it to promote their well-being and to really address some of the long-term anxiety that is all around us and really isn't reducing very much at the present time. And so one of the things that I've thought about is that we talk about long COVID as what is going happens to people who've had this horrid disease and the long-term physical and psychological mental health impacts. But actually, long COVID is probably something that many people will experience because the long COVID for them is around anxiety and mental health issues as well. We know about backlogs in physical health care and so on. So we need to think about how we can join up policy and practice. And as we move into the third wave here in this country and then later in Australia, we're going to look much more closely at how policy and practice can become more integrated. And we'll very much look forward to working with policymakers and practice partners as to what are the things we can constructively recommend for the changes that need to happen perhaps in both our countries going forward, so that we are aware of and can address the restrictions, the deaths, the lack of rituals, the hurt that will continue for some time to come. And as we go forward in both countries, as Peter rightly said, we are all living it, so we all have something to contribute. Thank you, Aidan.
Thank you, Jan. And thank you for all our presenters today. We had the overview of the study itself from Gabriela. We had the Australian perspective from Nick. Obviously, what's happening at the coalface in the counselling room from Peter, and Jan's thoughts around policy and practice. So really informative. If you would like to pose any questions, then please use the chat function and paste in the chat. I will then try to pick up the question and pass it to the panelists and see who's able to answer. I have one that's come in through the Q&A rather than the chat, so if you could use the chat, that would be better. But this is from Dwayne, a fascinating presentation, thanks to the team. Was there any data collected on what support respondents felt they needed to address some of the findings? So as well as seeing what they might be experiencing, were we able to collect anything that gave us insights into what they might actually want or need from their perspective? I think, Gabriela, is that one that you would have
Yes.
thoughts
Yes,
on?
no, thank you. Thank you. That's an excellent question. We haven't collected this data yet because we're planning to collect it in wave 3. We felt that sort of the first waves, 1 or 2, were rather reactive. We were focusing on what were the challenges. And in wave 3, we're going to ask people to reflect, and we're going to measure the service use, what type of services they use, what they felt their effectiveness were, and if effectiveness was not as expected, what else would they, found useful or to make those suggestions. So we're intending to collect that data retrospectively in the next wave, but it's an excellent question.
Okay, thank you, Gabriela. I'm still looking for questions coming in. There's got a very shy audience today, so we were slightly prepared because I have a couple of questions myself to ask. Oh no, here's one coming in now. Very informative, thank you. Did we identify what the protective factors were in Australia compared to the UK? This might be emerging rather than final. Is that one for Gabriela or Nick, or a combination of the two? The protective factors in Australia compared to the UK.
Well, I can say that we haven't yet looked in depth. So this is really just, we've done some descriptive analysis, which we reported today, and we're going to look into that. So obviously we can all guess the good weather will have made a huge difference. But more seriously, I think is the difference in the style of lockdowns. And Australia offers us a very interesting comparison because, as Nick said, some states were in lockdown and some states were not. So we will almost be able to do a three-way comparison of different styles, no lockdown, respondents from areas with no lockdown, those who suffered lockdowns, and then the UK. So we're going to look into much detail and beyond what the nice weather might have done for the well-being of people.
Thank you, Gabriela.
Nick, I think might want to comment as well.
No, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, the weather is lovely. So as soon as the international flights pick up, everyone, you're welcome to come and join us. But no, I think you're right, and clearly this is something that we need to study in greater depth, because I think it will prove fascinating. One area that I'm quite interested in is the level of government support and the investment of government. We had some very, I think, well targeted, perhaps too well, as the press is playing with at the moment in terms of where some of the money has gone, but particularly over the last year, over 2020, government support for businesses and for individuals, which I think alleviated some of the economic concerns and stresses that then created further tension. So that will be one area that will be interesting to look at. But yeah, as you say, Gabriela, I think there's a whole raft of things that we'll need to study in greater detail.
Okay, thank you, Nick. I think we're all interested in looking at how government support pans out, I would say, so that's certainly the case. A comment rather than a question from Penny Mansfield. We have seen the real value of digital provision for frontline support, direct to families, delivered through blended practice approaches, which we are currently evaluating. So an interesting comment there as well. Alison is writing, I've really appreciated the breadth of the study, including data from the UK and Australia. How long do you envisage the study continuing for? Would you consider researching other findings as a result of the study? Again, I think that's probably coming to you, Gabriela.
Yes, well, I can say that when we designed it, we expected that it would finish within 12 months. So it was planned as waves over a year, and that would have included the new normal. So we are adapting our research projects to the realities of unfolding pandemic. I think we definitely will want to follow up once whatever new normal settles, to understand how that looks, how life looks at the other end of the pandemic. But I also want to say that we now have a group of people and that have been offering us time, and the details, and we've got this detailed data at a time of unprecedented change, which will be very interesting to follow, to see what will happen perhaps even beyond the next year. So we're obviously relying on people's goodwill to participate, and the messages I've received from people who completed the survey were generally encouraging, saying keep up the good work and general interest on those findings. And I'm very keen with my colleagues researchers that we share the results, not just in academic or research outputs, but through public engagement events like this webinar. And we'll be, watch out, try to keep, if you're interested in the findings, just keep an eye for the the title of the study, and we'll be very interested to share as much as we learn with everybody.
Thank you, Gabriela. I'm going to try and move on. There's quite a few questions coming in. We're running out of time, but I see that Barbara Dunleavy has asked a question for Peter. Given that this has affected everyone, which he says makes this different in that counsellors have also been dealing with the lockdowns, etc., have counsellors needed more supervision or support? I think that's specific for you, Peter, because that's where you're sitting, of course.
Yeah, and I would agree with what Barbara's saying, that counsellors themselves have needed more support. And, you know, one of the things that both the centres where I work, the CEOs have tried to make a big effort to offer regular support. So it's not just supervision, it's been a whole centre approach. And I think that's something that's changed in a number of centres, recognising that we've needed to be more self-supportive of each other, and in a different way, getting to know each other in different ways. We're seeing in each other's houses. You know, we would normally see each other in the centre. Nobody would see, you know, what my living room looked like, or see my wife in the background sometimes, or, you know, a child, a dog, a cat, or the rest of it. So I think we have had to change how we are, and we've had to recognise our humanness rather than just the professional role that we take. And that level of support, I think, has been crucial at enabling people to survive. We didn't have any counsellors or therapists die in our centre, but in some centres they have. And I know that those centres have tried really hard to make sure people are supported to be able to manage and to keep going and provide a service to people that are really vulnerable when you're feeling vulnerable yourself.
Thank you, Peter. Roy is asking, will consideration be made regarding how schools can support parents more in terms of supporting home learning and the mental health of their children ongoing? I'm not sure if that's one, Jan, that you've got some thoughts on in terms of a policy and practice sense. Is that something from your perspective?
I mean, I think that we would be very keen to look at how all of the various sectors can work together to manage and support children and families, and hence Gabriela's invitation at the end to people in all sectors to share with us, to participate, to think about going forward how we may coordinate some of these things. I'm very aware from school teacher friends how hard many of them have been working to support children's learning and to make sure they don't fall too far behind with that. But I think it's an interesting question to look at what more we might have done to support children's in their own anxiety or in their own concern. And just as an aside, I was talking to a parent this week who said that before, their children had loved school. It was the most important part of their lives. And actually, they were really fearful about going back and had felt they'd lost touch with friends. And they were really concerned about having to go back into that environment. And of course, the press and media and everybody else tells us how often young people are being affected and how schools have to send classes home and that. So I think it's a really interesting question as to how, you know, always my thought is how we can be more holistic, more working across and helping everybody to do what they can to be supportive.
Thank you, Jan. Another point here from Dwayne, keen that as a network we can collectively use this evidence to shape policy and practice. We're expecting an announcement in the budget this afternoon about investment in family support. Are there things we can collectively do to shape the importance of relationship support as a vital intervention to address some of the issues highlighted? I think I could say, yes, there are things we can do as a network, and what we're discussing today and the work that Gabriela and Jan have been leading will absolutely give us evidence and pointers to exactly do that. So I think it is really important from that perspective. Helen Fish is asking, thank you all, really interesting and informative. What percentage increase have related seen in the use of their services and support offered since the start of the pandemic? That's a really interesting question because, and again, I can give some reflections on that. Across the Federation, we have quite a lot of variability. We have some centres that are having an increase in the activity in terms of what they're doing in terms of providing service. and we have other centres that have not been able to scale up sufficiently or have been able to respond to the demand, where operating as little as half as what they were prior to the pandemic. And we're seeking to learn from that in the way that we can continue to support people. What we do know is the switch from where we were previously to working digitally was incredibly fast and impressive. And I'm grateful for all the counsellors who were able to do that and to continue to support the people that we are here to work with. Let me see what else we've got. We have read, and many adult relationship counsellors in Relay will have noted an increase in the level of domestic abuse in couple relationships during the pandemic. Will your next wave of research investigate this? Really important issue, and we hear about this. So, Gabriela.
Yes, we have measured the incidence of family conflict and violence in all ways, but we need to look very carefully at this data because our sample is not representative, so it will be only representative for the population that we surveyed. From just exploring the data at this stage, we have not seen in our sample an increase beyond what you would expect in the general population. It doesn't mean that the incidences of family violence were not increased. It just that it may not have been reflected in our sample. So we've collected this data at wave 1, wave 2, and we'll keep collecting it to enable us to track it across the samples. But it's a question. It's a very important question, but needs to be very considered within the context before we can draw conclusions.
I think I'm going to have to draw the question to a close. I'm sorry, there's a couple of outstanding. I'll just leave one, probably unanswered, but floating for us. I wonder if you took into consideration the difference in press and social media attitude to the pandemic and lockdown in UK versus Australia. I think that's an interesting perspective for us to take. The environment around us in terms of what we hear and what we're told by media and press. I think that's a useful one to pick up. Well, I will seek before we finish to pick up the remaining questions so that we can feed them into the group that's following this study. But I realise I'm already on 12 o'clock and I'm trying to keep everything, make sure I finish properly or I'll be in trouble. So I really want to thank firstly everybody who presented today, Gabriela, Nick, Peter and Jan. But also I want to thank everybody who joined today, both to listen, but also to participate in terms of making comments and asking questions. So I really appreciate that. We, as I mentioned at the beginning, will be circulating or the webinar will be available on YouTube. And we plan to hold further webinars from the research in 2020. So look out for those invites and hope that you'll be able to join us again. So thank you all for this morning and for this evening, of course, in Australia. And I really appreciate your involvement and participation. Thank you and take care, everyone. Bye-bye.